Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to do a weekly read. I've read 11 books. Some of them are quite big, and a few of them require a separate video. So I'll try to give a good summary and my rating reaction to them, but reserve the meat of them for the other videos. First up, I read My Name is Lucy Barton by Elizabeth Strout on audio. I saw this on Matthew Sharpa's Best Books of the Year video that he did, and I did quite like it. It's about a daughter who's basically middle-aged and not quite elderly, but older mother who has a tumultuous relationship with each other. There's an ebb and flow. It's really good at encapsulating exactly the bits that you need to know about the relationship in a succinct manner, and there's basically no wasted space. It's beautifully written, very nice to consume, somewhat darker, I guess, than I expected in some ways. It is fairly critical of both of the women in its own way for specific things, and there is a turning point, a second part of the novel that is a little bit more sad and reflective, which resonated with me more. Of course, I tend to gravitate towards that stuff. I'll definitely read the next book. I thought it was interesting, and I gave it 4 stars. Next is Not My Father's Son, Alan Cumming. I saw this on a bunch of different places. I think Middle of the Bookmark Kim most predominantly made me excited to read this though. I read this on audio. And as she said, Alan Cumming is a fantastic narrator, as you would expect. I did not know that he was Scottish and had that thick of an accent. Similarly, I also really like that it wasn't about Hollywood, though he does sort of situate the movies or things that he was doing briefly with the reader so that they kind of know where they are in time and place, such as when he got casted for the Good Wife, stuff like that. But it's mostly just about his relationship with his father, who is very abusive in every way that a father can be abusive, basically. Except it's not, there's sexual degradation, but there's not sexual assault. And it's about his kind of reckoning with that, his trying to put it behind him, his work that he had to do that, the way it affected his life, how it affected everybody in his family's life, and just the general, machinations of that sort of plot in his life. I found it very inspiring and still hopeful nonetheless. Cumming navigates it to a point where he is undergone the reckoning that I spoke of, and that creates a cathartic event for the reader. It's very well plotted, it's very well written in my opinion. I'll definitely read more Cumming if he has other stuff out. Next, I read 36 Streets by T.R. Napper. This I thought was supposed to come out around January 16th, but when I Google it on Amazon and other places, it seems like it doesn't have a set release date. But the last time I checked, it was February something. It was about a month out because of supply stuff happening, I'm assuming. But I'll make a dedicated video for this because T.R. Napper directly contacted me on Twitter to see if I would review it, and I was more than happy to, because I also reviewed his short story collection, Neon Leviathan. That was excellent. And this was even better, in my opinion. He's definitely slowly refining his craft. It's set in the same world as established in Neon Leviathan, so people who have read that will get more out of it. And I found it very inclusive, subversive of genre. It's doing so many things right. I give it 4 out of 5 stars. Next is The Psychology of Time Travel by Kate Mascarenhas. And this is a book that kind of dropped with no fanfare or anything, but it was fairly well lauded from what I recall. I think it came out 2 years ago, something like that, maybe 3. But this is a great time travel novel with a focus on women, some of whom are queer. It's about these women who invent time travel. From the time that they invent it is the time that they can start to travel through, which is interesting. It is billed as very safe, but it is not necessarily so. One of the women appears to have had a psychotic break from using it, but they're not sure. Then it fast forwards in the future. There's a dead body found in 2017, I think, and it involves time travel. And so the people that are needing to find out who the killer is and all of that kind of stuff have a multi-layered thing to navigate. How do you find somebody who could be in any time? How do you find a culprit that could exist in multiple times, one of which they are the killer and one of which they're not? And a whole bunch of different stuff. And then it also, of course, focuses on the psychology of the thing. What kind of psychological effect time travel might have on the individual and what that might present as. It's written by a PhD, either candidate or person who has the doctorate already. I can't recall. More factual information than you would expect and makes sense as follows. And it really feels like it's fresh and new and interesting to the time travel stuff that is a little bit tired, at least for me. It's asking more interesting questions than most stuff does, and the characters are standout great. Next, I finished Black Hammer Volume 2, which is the conclusion of this overall arc. If you don't know, Black Hammer is about these superheroes that are sort of like caricatures or archetypes that are subverted or have a little bent or tilt to them. So much so that you would be able to pick out the superhero that they're based on, but then the differences are meaningful and interesting. For instance, there's a Shazam archetype where the young girl who became the Shazam thing, it's a Zephram, she has to say instead, grows into an older woman, but when she says the word, she still turns back into the young girl when she got those powers. And so there's this weird psychological effect where people's perception of her is still as a young girl, but she has all of these powers. She can fly. Her romantic situation is very messed up. But they try to defeat a person named Anti-God in the first volume, and then they wake up at a farm living their lives, and they cannot leave this space. And it's all about that kind of mystery, but also them dealing with not being superheroes anymore, trying to live their lives and move on, where the girl is stuck in her girl form, but she's 78 years old, and all that kind of stuff. There's a Barb alien who's kind of like that Mars guy from DC that I can't remember the name of, but he's queer as well, and the town is like this backwards 50s town that don't know where they come from but are kind of inclusive of them, but not the queer people, stuff like that. So it's a very interesting and weird story. It lent off at volume 1 with a cliffhanger that was very annoying, but this answers everything, and the 2 twists in it are fantastic. I gave this 5 stars. I really loved it. It built on the first volume expertly. There's a little bit of fluff, but it is completely worth it just for the ending. And then going forward, there's the world of Black Hammer, and kind of, I guess, does not go into these characters anymore. I guess it's complete. Next, I read the Love Songs of W.E.B Du Bois by Honorée, Fanonne Jeffers. This I dual read on audio and book, but I returned it to the library already. I still have some library books, but I returned that immediately because it's in such high demand. And so I finished it in 4 days or something like that, despite its huge length, or at least the way that it feels is huge sometimes. So this is a hard book to talk about, and it's gonna be one of the books that I make a whole video on because there's so much to go into. In short, I feel it was a little bit overhyped to most people, mostly because the prose for the contemporary time period is not that great. It's Hemingway-esque in a bad way, in the sense that Hemingway can pull it off because he uses full stops as like arrestor hooks that he jumps off from, basically. He's very specific, he's very descriptive, and a lot of people use the simple framework without using those aspects of writing, and they fall short. And it's unfortunate because it's very much lauded in today's literary circles as the model to be held to, basically, despite the fact that they don't agree with the specificity, the descriptive language, and other aspects to writing that make the prose actually good. And Hemingway himself, I think, vacillates between his own styles greatly. He has some good stuff, he has some terrible stuff, and people seem to not care and just try to emulate him regardless. And so the contemporary is kind of like that, but as it goes into historical fiction and stuff, that stuff was excellent. Maybe because it was the genre expectations of historical fiction, but description, specificity, all that stuff, it's basically inverted, and I love the prose. The book itself is about Ailey, who, well, it's about her entire family. It goes from colonization and slave trade to post-slavery to contemporary times, and it basically goes through her entire family tree from the time that they became slaves. It takes a long time to get your hooks into the book, much longer than most people are going to be willing to. It's probably 400 pages to 500 pages before you start feeling how this book is coming together. You have to trust that the author's going somewhere. There's a lot of faith to put into like a debut, I believe this is, or close to it. It kind of reads like sophomoric anyway. And so the issue becomes less and less pronounced as you go on, because you begin to be filled into the sort of lattice work or the web of her family members, and the thematic through lines become more present. After everything is established, when a family event occurs, more or less you can expect for that thematic through line to be driven into all the other chapters of the established characters as well. So if there is, for instance, a pedophilic event between an elder and a younger girl, because this is all about the women of the family primarily, it then goes and traces that to slavery or colonialism times, basically, or to civil war, stuff like that. There's a reason all of this stuff has happened, and it is beyond the one male that is perpetrating it at that time. And so it feels fair to the character while also necessarily condemning their actions and not feeling like they are being vilified, but that they themselves are also a product of the things that made them, but they are perpetuating the traumatic cycle as well. So I felt it was very nuanced in that way, and there's a lot of different themes being built upon. There is so much foundation, and it is methodically constructed in a very slow manner, in the way that you're seeing the bones and the foundation and the siding of a house and everything constructed. So it can be kind of like paint drying a little bit, but once you understand the way that it was built, you can appreciate the house in a much more thorough manner. And so that's the strength of it. But the byproduct is that you're going to have to, as I said, wade through a lot of the book before you see any sort of dividends paying off. Next is Nervous System by Lina, translated by Megan McDowell. This book was excellent. I gave it 5 stars, I'll say that. And this also was kind of a slog, but for very different, well, actually kind of a little bit similar reasons. Not the prose, but this book is so heavy that I could only take it in sort of bite-sized pieces. Its tone is very melancholic, honest, earnest in everything. So depending on how many spoons you have, this is going to take up quite a few. So just be prepared for that. It is about a young woman, Ella, who is doing a PhD thesis. So she's a candidate in astrophysics. Her father is a doctor, and basically she begins to suffer from some kind of affliction that cannot be diagnosed, and we proceed from there. It is her deep-seated anxieties that are rooted throughout the book, and they only go more pronounced, more graphic, more probably difficult to process as well as we go, though each section proceeds to a different medical event with a different family member that both characterizes them and sort of elucidates Ella's feelings about the specific malady or life itself in relation to the disease, medical practice, her father. And this whole time there's a underlying sort of B plot going on that is about her thesis. She still needs to figure out what she's doing and what she's going to write about. She has tried multiple times to get this going and feels sort of lost. And then the addition of a medical problem doesn't help that at all. So this book will definitely, I think, work to make you feel like she does, like in an approximation, of course. You're gonna feel anxious as well reading this. It has got the most beautiful prose that I've probably consumed. The formatting and the structure is perfect. It is, yeah, it's a dichotomy reading it. It's simultaneously the most beautiful thing that you've ever consumed, but also the most draining thing that you've ever consumed, at least if you're me. And so it's such a success at the meta level of just looking at the construction of it that it's kind of like overwhelming to even speak about, I think. Just for its form meets function being perfect, as well as just the fact that the things that she talks about is so subjective that you can't really pass judgment on them. I mean, I guess you could, but it would be pointless. And so I'm not sure how to sell this or recommend it to somebody else, but I would say that at the end, even if you don't like dark or depressive or melancholic type of literature that makes you actually feel that way and isn't just presented that way, it has a wonderful ending that I think brings things together in such a hopeful way. Both generations in this are essentially okay with people failing, despite it taking a massive toll on their personhood, on their relationships with other people, including the most primarily their family members, or the people that they perceive as their family as well, like very close people, lovers, etc. And so it's very, well, I described it as a hat trick, basically, where it was another thing that it pulled out of the hat, in addition to the prose and the form meets function, that it can leave you with thoughts of hopefulness and forgiveness and insight. Next, I wanted something lighthearted, so I read Comey Can't Communicate. This was fine. It's a little bit, well, so first of all, it's about a girl who can't communicate. She's very shy, very introverted, she doesn't have social skills, and a boy that thinks she's beautiful takes to liking her. Her goal is to make 100 friends. They communicate, at least initially, on chalkboards, basically like texting each other. I don't know why they don't text each other, but you know, it's somewhat cute, somewhat of an interesting premise. I thought it was just fine, as most funny things generally are to me, but it's also kind of, in a manga kind of way, very like pandering to fans, especially in presenting and drawing Komi. She's pretty sexualized, even though she's not interested in that and she's not expressing that in the scene. She's still very male gazy. And so I just, yeah, it kind of water off a duck's back, basically. Next, I read Fun Home, a family tragicomic by Alison Bechdel. I gave this 4 stars. On the other one, I gave 3 stars. P.S. I saw this on Bob the Booker's channel recently, thought I'd give it a try, and I quite liked it. I thought it was a little bit of a mess structurally. There are parts where she is speaking about how her father was not an out gay man, married her mother, and of course had kids, had her. But later in life, it was came to light that he was having illicit affairs with other men, and she herself was kind of shuttered and closeted by him, which causes a very weird dichotomy for her and a very weird childhood. And then later comes out as a queer woman, a gay woman, I believe. And the parts in which she is analyzing her father and paralleling her life with his, as well as introducing critical lit theory in her younger sort of college life, a shared passion between her father and her, are some of the best writing ever, basically. I thought they were perfect. But there are other aspects where it feels like it is off the garden path and wants to be a complete autobiography and not a targeted memoir, and just were parts that I wanted to leave to get back to this sort of main through line that was so predominantly good. Those chapters, you'll notice, are like very heavy on exposition, dialogue. The pages are super cluttered. And then when she is talking about her father or her queer experience or literary theory and stuff like that, it is presented in a very juxtaposition kind of way. Very sparse, very specific, well written, not cluttered, thematically cogent, excellent stuff. So I overall gave it 4 stars. I thought it was great. I definitely would read more from her, especially if this is a debut. I'm not sure if it is or not. But it was very compelling and I would definitely recommend it. There's some very interesting thoughts in regards to queer reading, queer experience. Her father, though obviously not a good man and didn't treat her very well in a lot of ways, and her family and her mother, she manages to humanize him while not letting him off the hook, I think, and then using otherwise very painful memories and experience to define herself in an empowering way, I think. Whew. And next I finished House of Leaves. So yeah, I tabbed a little bit. This book has a few layers. It in itself is constructed kind of like a labyrinth, but I think overall its goal is to become a mirror in which the reader sees themselves and in turn kind of enters their own labyrinth and defines their own subjective read of what this book is about, because I think it is about a lot of different things. The reading is so subjective, again, that you could project basically whatever you want onto the text and it might support you. So my own reading is these pink tabs, this where I've marked sort of the plot and themes that I was going for, and I think it is held up very well. But there are multiple layers, as mentioned. The first is a ostensible film critical review that parodies academic text, where it is breaking down a film that is a cult following but never existed. It goes into such granular detail that you experience the film in a different way than consuming it only visually. It's much more comprehensive an experience. It goes into very in detail thoughts about lighting, constructing an actual film, shot composition, very granular stuff about that. And in such a way that it very much feels as though the writer of that text, Zampano, is in his own little maze. He's spiraling, essentially, writing about the film. Just as within the film itself, the Navidson tapes are about a family that set down roots in a colonial house close to Virginia, close to Jamestown, and as they set down roots, it is sort of literalizes their head of house, Will Navidson, his trauma, his dark room, his labyrinth, is literalized in the house. It is born from his need to go into the last adventure, the internal journey, the epitomous journey basically, or the quintessential one, in which every journey is a journey inward, becomes literalized. And so his last adventure, that was to be giving up his wartime photography and taking journeys and explorations and stuff like that, to setting down roots with his wife Karen and his 2 children, to become a father, is subsumed by his desire for the one last exploration. And so the house undergoes a metamorphosis after they leave and come back from a vacation of some kind, something like that. The house actually physically alters itself, it grows bigger, and it has a door with a hallway in it that leads to a maze. There's a foyer, and then there's a spiral staircase, and then endless rooms to be navigated. And Navidson is unable to navigate them because Karen puts her foot down and says that if he goes in there, then this little experiment's over, divorce is coming, etc. So other people try to navigate it and are unwilling to or unable to. And what follows is essentially a horror story that is chronicled by Navidson himself, having put up cameras all over the house in a very like paranormal activity kind of way. And eventually, of course, events conspire to make Navidson, or ostensibly make him, enter his own maze, navigate it, and the story proceeds from there without spoilers. Then interjecting into the Zampano narrative that is talking about that film, there's Johnny Truant's story, a made-up fictitious name, ostensibly about a guy who finds Zampano dead with a trunk that is the House of Leaves, this book. And he interjects his own story at certain points in the narrative, which becomes clear that he is being triggered by his own trauma as a child that is rooted in his mother and certain events that occur. There's a lot of different hints and the whale's toe letters appendix in the back that point to the fact that Johnny is not a well person, and he may follow in his mother's footsteps insofar as having some sort of diagnosis with a mental component to it, possibly schizophrenia, we don't know. And so Johnny himself is similarly spiraling, entering the spiral, just as Zampano did, and lost his life to it presumably, just as Navidson enters his own spiral, and things occur from there as well. The events are mirrored in all 3 of the stories, and so we don't really know what the primary text is, even in its presentation, because they all follow the same sort of pattern. Johnny's is one of debauchery and sexual exploits that are fictitious and used to obfuscate the parts when he should be talking about his trauma, which are prompted by the traumatic events that he is reading about. He is obsessed with a stripper. He works at a inking place, whatchamacallit, ink tattoo, a tattoo parlor. And he eventually is completely consumed with compiling this book, potentially. And he, it is said, at least in the text, goes missing at one point, and his editor ends up compiling everything that he can and publishing it again. But this is just a facsimile or a simulacrum of a book, all presented from presumably the author, Mark. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but I think primarily, as I mentioned, themes of trauma, colonization, and needing to navigate a world with your trauma is entering a spiral staircase with less light than those people that are well adjusted and not having to carry the burden of trauma, and the fact that everybody at one point in their life, whether they like it or not, is going to enter the labyrinth regardless. And then the last book that I read is Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. And this was a pretty interesting book. It was better than I expected, especially because in the beginning it's just a straight up retelling, and I was kind of like, why does this exist? I know all of these events already. She isn't adding too much to it. But eventually, as it goes throughout her entire story, more so than what I was already privy to by consuming other myths, it traces her entire life story as well as her sister's, Phaedra. It draws a through line within the myths and the specific codified events that is very interesting, because it becomes like a feminist text in which she is pointing out that some of these events, while they may have taken place, are being colored by the male lens and the male gaze. And so a lot of these events, or some of them at least, could have been fictitious in order to further the male power story. Basically, the emulation of the gods is a cyclical thing that continues to make the men that look up to the gods and the demigods behave in a very destructive manner that almost always inevitably hurts women. And so the story becomes very multifaceted and elucidates on the specific events that you already know, or at least most people already know, I believe. It's probably the most predominant of myths that appear in it anyway. In a way, it still perpetuates the same stories that basically use women to educate men and to take something away from men by removing the women from the story in usually horrific ways, but casts a more stark light on that and asks why that is, and in so doing kind of points to the reader that it's replicating societal issues and not just like silly funny stories that happen to women or horrific stories that happen to women that aren't rooted in societal issues reflective of that time and today. So I thought it was quite clever. I gave it 4 stars. Excellent narration on the audiobook. The only thing I am consuming currently is the Red Chesterfield, which I saw on Bookworm Adventure Girl's channel. It's very odd. It says, the Red Chesterfield is a delightful, unusual novel that upends the tropes and traditions of crime fiction while asking how far one person is willing to go to solve a crime, be it murder or the abandonment of a piece of furniture. So it's very like surrealistic, very strange, it's sparse. Every chapter is no more than 1 page. It reads like a neurodivergent, maybe queer lens, I'm not too sure, and from a marginalized perspective while working for a government body. The peace officer who's indigenous finds a Red Chesterfield that feels like the embodiment of like good living, support, moneyed, etc., but there's a dead body in it. And then things sort of unravel from there. But I'm really enjoying it. It's going to be a quick read. I'm already halfway through it and I've been reading it for like 30 minutes or something. So if you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear what you have to say. If you have any recommendations based on the books that I've already consumed, or if you just want to interact with me at all, hit me up in the comments, and otherwise I will see you next video.